"You will sleep on my bed," the giant Apache girl said, the lonely famer. He woke up before the sun rose, ready to face the long day ahead. The farm, nestled in the middle of the rugged, unforgiving frontier, had been his home for as long as he could remember. It was a quiet place, far from the bustling towns and cities, and far from any neighbors. Caleb had always preferred it that way. He liked the peace and the solitude, but as time went on, that peace began to feel more like loneliness. He had inherited the farm from his father, a man of strong hands and even stronger will. Caleb's father had taught him everything about the land, the best times to plant crops, how to care for the animals, and the many ways to survive when times were tough. Caleb remembered the old man's gruff voice, always full of advice, even if it was often delivered with a scowl or a grunt. His father had been a man who didn't ask for help and rarely gave it, but there was always something comforting about his presence. He had a way of making Caleb feel like everything would be okay, no matter how hard the work got. But then, everything changed. When Caleb was still a young man, his mother had passed away, followed by his father a few years later. Since then, the farm had been his responsibility alone. He didn't mind the hard work. It was something he had been raised to do. But the isolation, the long nights with no one to share a meal or a story with, that was the part that weighed on him the most. The silence was his only company. And sometimes it felt like it was closing in on him. Caleb had tried to fill the void by working harder, but there was only so much he could do on his own. The animals needed tending, the crops needed care, and the fences always seemed to be falling down. His hands were calloused and worn from years of labor, but they never seemed to be enough to fix everything. No matter how hard he worked, it never felt like he was getting ahead. Even the seasons didn't change much. Winters were long and harsh, and summers were hot and dry. Every year it seemed like the land took more than it gave. The harvest was never as good as he hoped, and the animals always seemed to be one sickness away from a disaster. Caleb often wondered if he was cursed, if the farm was destined to be a place where no one could truly be happy. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It was the quiet. The silence of the farm was deafening, and Caleb began to miss the sound of a voice, the warmth of someone sitting across from him at the dinner table. He longed for the companionship he once had, even though he never spoke about it. He buried his feelings deep inside, focusing all his energy on keeping the farm alive. But at night, when the stars were bright in the sky and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, he felt the loneliness more than ever. It wasn't just the silence that bothered him. It was the memories.
Caleb had been married once, to a kind woman named Sarah. She had been his partner in every sense of the word.
Together they had dreamed of building a family on the farm, growing old together and watching their children run through the fields. But life had other plans. Sarah had become ill, a sickness that no one could explain or cure. Caleb had tried everything. He called for doctors from nearby towns. He brought in healers from other parts of the country, but nothing worked. Sarah faded away slowly, leaving Caleb with a hollow ache in his heart that never quite healed. Her death had left a hole in his life, one that nothing could fill. He had lost not just a wife, but a companion, a partner, and a friend. Since then, Caleb had thrown himself into the work, hoping that if he kept busy enough, the pain would eventually go away. But it never did. It only seemed to grow stronger as the years passed. Sometimes when he stood in the fields or sat by the fire, he could almost hear Sarah's voice in the wind. It was a cruel reminder of the life he had once had and lost. Despite the loneliness, Caleb continued with his routine. He knew no other way to live. Every day he woke up to tend to the farm, and every night he went to bed exhausted, his body sore from the day's labor. He didn't complain. There was no one to listen, anyway. The days blurred together, and it seemed like the years were slipping away faster than he could keep up. He was growing older, and his strength was fading, but the farm still needed him. There was no other choice. One evening, as Caleb finished his chores and prepared to settle in for another long night of solitude, something unexpected happened.
As he was about to lock up the barn, he noticed a figure in the distance.
It was hard to make out at first, as the storm clouds had begun to roll in, casting a dark shadow over the land. But as the figure drew closer, Caleb could see that it was a woman, a tall figure walking through the rain. She was moving slowly, as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, and she wore long, flowing clothes that flapped in the wind. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but something about her presence felt different from anyone he had ever encountered. Breath. Caleb hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should approach her. Stranger or not, it wasn't safe to be out in the storm. He quickly made up his mind and grabbed a lantern, walking toward her. As he got closer, he could see that she was not only soaked to the bone, but also carrying something. Maybe a bundle of supplies, or a bag. Her shoulders were slumped, and her movements seemed slow, almost exhausted. It was clear that she had been traveling for a long time, and the storm had only made her journey harder.
"Are you lost?" Caleb asked, his voice hesitant.
You can come inside and get out of the rain. It's not safe out here. Breaking. Caleb was taken aback by her striking appearance. She was much taller than most women he had seen, easily several inches taller than him, and there was a quiet strength in her eyes. She didn't seem frightened by Caleb's offer, but there was a weariness about her, like she had been through something far worse than the storm. "My name is Kea," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been traveling for days." Caleb nodded and gestured toward the barn. "You can stay here for the night." "I'll get you some dry clothes and a meal. Come inside." The woman hesitated for only a moment before following him inside. As she stepped into the warm light of the barn, Caleb couldn't help but notice how she moved, her long legs and strong posture, as though she was used to walking long distances and carrying heavy loads. There was an air of quiet dignity about her, and Caleb found himself wondering who she was and where she had come from. But for now, all he could do was offer her the hospitality his father had taught him. There was no need for questions or explanations. Caleb had learned long ago that sometimes a simple kindness was enough. As he prepared a place for her by the fire, Caleb realized that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. The storm raged outside, but in the warmth of the barn there was a sense of calm. The storm outside raged on through the night, but inside the barn there was a quiet warmth. Caleb moved quickly around the small space, preparing a meal for the stranger he had invited into his home. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't used to having someone in his space. As he set a simple plate of bread and stew by the fire, Caleb couldn't help but glance over at the woman sitting across from him. She was tall, much taller than most women Caleb had known, and there was a strength in her presence that was impossible to ignore. Her long, dark hair was soaked, and her clothes, though simple, were practical. Despite the harsh weather outside, she sat still, her posture relaxed but alert. But Caleb wasn't sure what to make of her. He had never been one to judge by appearance alone, but there was something about her that intrigued him. She didn't seem afraid, despite being so far from home in a storm, and that made Caleb wonder where she had come from and what kind of life she had led.
"My name is Kaya," she had said earlier when Caleb first offered her shelter.
There was something calm and steady in her voice, and despite her towering figure, she seemed unthreatening. Still, Caleb had been cautious, didn't know her, and it wasn't easy to trust a stranger. especially one who appeared in the middle of a storm without explanation. The fire crackled in the corner of the barn, casting soft light across the room. And how? Caleb sat opposite her, waiting for her to speak again. But Kaya was quiet, watching the fire as though lost in thought. Psst. Caleb knew it wasn't polite to pry, but his curiosity got the best of him. "Where are you from?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "I don't often see many people passing through this part of the country." Kaya's eyes flicked up to meet his for the first time since she entered the barn. Her gaze was steady and calm, like someone who had seen much of the world and wasn't easily rattled. "I come from the West," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "My people, the Apache, live there. But I had to leave." Her words hung in the air for a moment before Caleb could find the courage to respond. He had heard stories about the Apache people before, stories of fierce warriors and strong, proud tribes, but he didn't know much beyond that.
"He certainly didn't expect to meet one here, in the middle of the storm." "I see," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice even.
He didn't want to sound rude, but he was uncertain how to continue the conversation. Kaya took a deep breath, and for the first time she looked at him directly. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, something Caleb hadn't expected. It wasn't the cold, distant look he had imagined. Instead, it was the look of someone who had been through much hardship and was now, for whatever reason, searching for something more. "My tribe, we were driven from our lands," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"It wasn't safe anymore. I had to leave."
"Bet. So, I've been wandering for a long time." Caleb nodded, understanding the weight of her words, even though he couldn't fully grasp the depth of her experience. Breath. He knew what it was like to lose something. He had lost his family, his wife, to illness, and the grief had been unbearable. But he couldn't imagine what it would feel like to lose everything, to have to leave everything behind as Kaya had. Caleb asked gently, not wanting to pry but wanting to help. He felt a sense of responsibility to her, especially since he had invited her in. The kindness his father had instilled in him was strong, and Caleb was determined to offer what little help he could. Kaya hesitated, looking down at the fire. It was clear she hadn't planned for a future. "I don't know," she said softly. "I'll just keep moving. I've always kept moving." Caleb sensed that there was more she wasn't saying. He didn't press her for more details. After all, he knew what it was like to hold your own pain close, to keep certain things hidden. Still, he felt a stirring of sympathy for this woman, so far from her people, alone in the storm. "I can offer you shelter for as long as you need," Caleb said, his voice steady. "You don't have to leave right away." Kaya gave him a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you. But I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "I live alone out here. There's plenty of room for both of us." For a moment, the two of them sat in silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant howling of the wind outside. Caleb felt the weight of the silence settle over him. But it wasn't uncomfortable. For once, it wasn't the kind of silence that made him feel isolated. Kaya didn't seem like someone who was asking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for pity or even help. But Caleb could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed to sag with the weight of her journey.
She was strong, yes, but she was tired, and Caleb could relate to that.
"What happened to your tribe?" Caleb asked after a while, his curiosity piqued again. Kaya's expression hardened slightly, though there was still a sadness in her eyes. The soldiers came. They took our land, our homes, our lives. Her voice was steady, but Caleb could hear the pain beneath her words. Many of my people fought back, but we were outnumbered. I had to leave to survive. Caleb could see the pain in her eyes now, the depth of her loss. He could see that the words she spoke were not just stories. These were her memories, her history. It was a story of survival, of strength, and of a people who had been wronged. He didn't know how to respond, so he stayed quiet, offering only the warmth of the fire as comfort. The hours passed quickly, and Caleb found himself at ease in Kaya's presence. The quiet strength she exuded was different from his own. She didn't need to speak loudly or boast of her power. There was a quiet assurance in the way she carried herself. Caleb couldn't help but feel a sense of respect growing for her. She was not the kind of person to ask for help. She was the kind of person who would endure no matter the cost. The storm outside finally began to ease, but the wind still howled through the trees, rattling the walls of the barn. Caleb stood and stretched, his muscles aching from the long day's work. He gestured toward a small cot beside the fire. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "Break. I'll take the bench." Kaya looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "Thank you." Caleb turned to leave, but then Kaya's voice stopped him. "Caleb!" He paused and turned back to look at her. "You've been kind to me," Kaya said quietly. I don't know why, but I trust you."
Caleb's chest tightened.
Trust was a rare thing, especially for someone like Kaya. He nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of his own loneliness. "I trust you too, Kaya." She gave him a small smile, and for the first time since she had arrived, Caleb saw something softer in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the quiet understanding that in this moment they were no longer alone. The fire continued to crackle, the storm outside was a fading memory, and inside the barn, Caleb found himself a little less lonely than he had been before. The days following Kaya's arrival were different, but Caleb had grown used to the solitude of his farm, where his only companions were the animals and the unbroken silence of the land. But with Kaya there, the silence didn't feel as heavy. Her presence was calming, yet filled with a quiet intensity that Caleb couldn't ignore.
As the storm faded and the weather cleared, Caleb resumed his usual routine, working the fields, tending to the animals, and repairing the old fences that needed constant attention.
But now, there was someone by his side. Kaya didn't ask for anything. She simply followed him around, watching him work, offering her help when needed. At first, Caleb was unsure whether to let her assist. He didn't want to impose or make her feel uncomfortable, but Kaya insisted. She had a quiet strength about her that made Caleb realize she was no ordinary woman.
Her help was invaluable.
She could carry large bundles of hay with ease, and she worked with a sense of purpose that Caleb admired. There was something in the way she moved, fluid, effortless, that made him realize how much he had been missing in his solitary life. He had grown used to doing everything himself, but having someone to share the work with felt different. It wasn't just the physical help that made it easier. It was the fact that he wasn't alone anymore. One afternoon, as the two of them worked together in the field, Caleb paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. Kaya was carrying a heavy load of firewood, and despite the weight, she moved with the ease of someone who had done this her whole life. Breath. Caleb stood for a moment watching her, and then spoke up.
"You're strong," he said, his voice soft.
Stronger than most people I know. Kaya stopped for a moment, glancing back at him with a small smile.
"I've had to be," she replied quietly.
Life doesn't always give us the luxury of being weak.
There was a sadness in her voice, but Caleb didn't press her for more. He could tell that Kaya had been through a lot, that her past wasn't something she liked to talk about.
But in her silence, Caleb also sensed a deep well of wisdom, of strength that went beyond physical power. She had survived. There was no doubt about that. "I know what you mean," Caleb said, his voice low. "Life's never been kind to me either. But sometimes we just keep going. We don't have a choice."
Kaya nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's true.
We just keep moving forward. It's the only way. The two of them continued to work in silence for a while, but the air between them had shifted. There was no longer any awkwardness between them. Caleb had grown used to Kaya's quiet presence, and Kaya had come to respect Caleb's strength, even if it was more in his spirit than in his physical abilities. As the days passed, they began to share more about themselves, though the conversation was never forced.
Caleb told Kaya about his childhood on the farm, about the years spent learning from his father, and how he had always felt a sense of pride in working the land.
But he also spoke about the emptiness he felt after losing Sarah, the way the farm became a prison of sorts after her death. Kaya listened intently, her gaze steady, and Caleb could feel the weight of her understanding. She didn't pity him. Instead, she seemed to recognize the pain in his voice, the same kind of pain she carried herself. And that was enough.
Caleb didn't need her to fix it. He just needed her to listen.
In turn, Kaya began to share her story. She spoke of her tribe, her people, and the way they lived before everything changed. She told Caleb about the beauty of her homeland, the wide plains, the tall mountains, and the rivers that ran like veins through the earth. But she also spoke of the hardships her people had faced, of the constant struggle to protect their land and their way of life. And finally, she spoke of her decision to leave, to wander alone in search of safety.
Caleb could hear the sadness in her voice, but there was also a quiet strength there, a resilience that reminded him of his own struggles.
She had fought for survival, just like him. The world had thrown hardships at them both, but they had continued to stand, to move forward, even when it seemed impossible. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between them grew. They worked together in the fields, prepared meals side by side, and sat together by the fire at night, sharing the stillness of the world around them.
The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a kind of peace that they had both learned to appreciate.
They didn't need to talk all the time. Sometimes, just being near each other was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink, Caleb found himself watching Kaya. She was standing by the edge of the field, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, as if lost in thought. Caleb couldn't help but notice how beautiful she looked in the fading light. There was something serene about her, a quiet beauty that wasn't immediately apparent but revealed itself in the way she carried herself. "Do you miss your people?" Caleb asked, his voice soft. Kaya turned to him, her expression unreadable for a moment before she spoke. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss the land, the way it felt to be home. But I don't miss the violence, the fear. I don't miss the fighting." He glances around in desperate. Caleb nodded. He understood. He had his own kind of fear of losing the farm, fear of never finding peace again. But for now, he was content. He had Kaya's company, and the farm was doing better than it had in years. The crops were healthy, the animals were thriving, and the land felt a little less harsh. Caleb knew that he had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for, a sense of purpose, a sense of family. And it was something he hadn't expected to find in a stranger, in a woman he had only met by chance. They stood there for a moment, the evening breeze stirring the air between them. Caleb could feel the warmth of her presence, the calm strength she radiated. It was a strange feeling, to have someone like Kaya by his side, someone so different from him yet so alike in many ways. They had both been through hardship, and they had both survived. But more than that, they had learned to live with the past without letting it consume them. First, "I'm glad you are here," Caleb said quietly, his words simple but sincere. Kaya's lips curved into a small smile. "I'm glad, too." The two of them stood together side by side, watching the stars slowly emerge in the night sky. The world was still, and for the first time in a long while Caleb felt at peace. The land no longer seemed so vast and empty. With Kaya by his side, the silence didn't feel so lonely. In that moment, Caleb realized that he had found something more than just a companion. He had found someone who understood, someone who could walk beside him through the storms of life. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The morning after their quiet evening, Caleb woke early, as he always did, to begin his work. He stepped out of the barn and into the crisp air, the sun still low on the horizon. The weather had been mild and the crops were growing well, but he could already tell it would be a good harvest this year, the kind of harvest he hadn't had in a long time. But as he worked, something was different. Caleb could feel the weight of the morning pressing down on him. It wasn't the land or the work. It was something else. But he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. Around mid-morning, when Caleb was fixing one of the old fences near the edge of the property, he saw the familiar shape of a figure walking toward him, one of his neighbors from the town. It was Bill Harper, a man Caleb had known for years. Bill wasn't much of a friend, more of an acquaintance, but they had shared a few quiet drinks at the local saloon over the years. Caleb hadn't seen Bill in weeks, so it was unusual for him to be out here, especially so early in the day. As Bill came closer, Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could tell something was wrong.
"Morning, Caleb," Bill greeted him, though his tone wasn't as friendly as usual. "We need to talk."
He set down his hammer, wiping his hands on his pants, and straightened up. Breaths. "What's the matter, Bill?" Bill didn't answer immediately. He shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable, before glancing over his shoulder. "It's about the woman you've got living here." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He knew this moment would come eventually, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. He kept his face neutral, though a tightness in his chest betrayed his nerves. "Kaya?" Caleb asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Brett." Bill nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "We've heard about her, Caleb. Some folks in town saw her coming through a few days ago, and it doesn't sit right with them. There's talk that she's one of the Apache. You know the history between them and us."
Caleb's pulse quickened. He had feared this moment, knowing that there were people in town who wouldn't take kindly to Kaya's presence. He also knew that some people, especially those with old grudges, might see her as nothing more than a threat.
"I know what you're talking about, Bill," Caleb replied evenly, trying to keep his temper in check. "She's a traveler. She's been through some rough times, and she's not causing any harm. She's just looking for a place to rest." Bill scoffed. "You're being too soft on her, Caleb."
You've got no idea who she really is. We can't have someone like her living so close.
You know what people will say. You've got a reputation to think about. Breath. "I don't care about my reputation," Caleb said, his voice firmer now. "What matters to me is that she's not a threat to anyone. She's just trying to survive. Just like the rest of us." Bill's eyes hardened, and he stepped a little closer. You're making a big mistake, Caleb. People in town are already talking. If you don't send her away, things could get ugly.
We can't have someone like her on your farm. Not here. Not now! Caleb felt a surge of anger.
He had always kept to himself, never caused trouble, and never asked for anyone's approval. But this was different. He had Kaya's trust, and he wasn't going to let anyone tear that down. Not Bill. Not anyone. Then you'll have to tell them that I'm not sending her away, Caleb said, his voice unwavering. She's welcome here. She's done nothing wrong, and I'll be damned if I turn her out just because of who she is. Bill's expression darkened, and for a moment, Caleb thought the conversation might escalate into something worse. But Bill seemed to think better of it. With a last, frustrated glance, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. Caleb stood there for a moment, his heart still pounding. He didn't want to make enemies, especially not with the people in town, but he couldn't back down. Kaya had trusted him, and he wasn't going to betray her now. That afternoon, as Caleb worked in the barn, Kaya appeared at the doorway, her face calm but her eyes filled with concern. She had clearly overheard part of the conversation between Caleb and Bill, and she was no fool. Breath. She knew what was coming. "Caleb," she said quietly, stepping inside the barn. "What did he want?" Caleb paused, wiping his brow with his sleeve before turning to face her. "He was just worried about you," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "Some people in town are talking. They're not happy that you're here." Kaya nodded, her expression unreadable. She seemed unsurprised by the news, for she had spent enough time in the world to know how people could be, especially when it came to someone different, someone like her.
Breaths.
"I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said softly, her voice tinged with a hint of regret.
"I never wanted to make things harder for you." Caleb shook his head. "You haven't caused any trouble." Breath. "Bill's just worried about his reputation, and the rest of the town will follow his lead if we let them. But I won't turn you out. I gave you my word." Kaya's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to Caleb. "You don't have to protect me, Caleb. I can leave if it's causing you too much trouble." Breath. Caleb reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "No."
You're staying here, Kaya. You've done nothing wrong.
If anyone has a problem with that, they can come talk to me. Kaya was silent for a moment, then nodded.
"Thank you, Caleb. I don't know what I would do without you."
Caleb didn't respond. There was nothing to say.
The bond between them had grown stronger over the past few weeks, and Caleb knew that what they had now was something rare, something worth fighting for. He wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The next day, Caleb went into town to collect supplies. He knew that he would face the murmurs and the stares, but he didn't care. He walked into the local store with his head held high, ignoring the whispers that followed him. He made his purchases quickly and left without saying a word to anyone. When he returned home, he was met with silence. He knew that word had already spread. Despair. Some people would refuse to speak to him now, and others would treat him like an outsider. But Caleb was prepared for that. He wasn't going to let their prejudice dictate his actions. Kaya was a person, not a problem. She deserved kindness, just like anyone else. As the days passed, the tension in the town didn't fully subside. Caleb heard bits and pieces of the gossip, the judgments, the whispered complaints, but he ignored it. His focus was on his farm, on the work that needed to be done, and on the life he was building with Kaya by his side. In the end, the townspeople learned something important about Caleb, but he wasn't afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant standing alone.
He wasn't just a farmer. He was a man of conviction, and that was something the town hadn't expected.
Breath. And as for Kaya, she remained a quiet presence at the farm, always working beside Caleb, always with that same calm strength. The world may not have been kind to her, but Caleb would always protect her. Together they would face whatever came their way, side by side. The sun rose over the farm, casting a soft golden light across the fields, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt a sense of contentment. The past few months had been filled with challenges, moments of tension with the townspeople, long days spent working the land, and the weight of uncertainty that had hung over him. But now, as he stood on the porch of the barn, watching the land he had worked so hard to restore, he felt something different. He felt a kind of peace, one that had been missing for far too long. Kaya had become more than just a guest in his home. She had become a partner, someone who shared in the labor, the quiet moments, and the weight of the past. Caleb had never expected to find someone like her, but now, as he watched her work alongside him, he couldn't imagine life without her. The farm was thriving, the crops growing strong and healthy, and the animals well fed. Break. It wasn't just the work that had changed. There was a new energy on the farm, a sense of life and hope that had been absent for years. Caleb didn't feel alone anymore. Kaya's presence had filled the silence, and her quiet strength had given him the courage to keep going, even on the toughest days. Each morning, Kaya joined him for breakfast. They sat together at the small table in the barn, sharing simple meals of bread, eggs, and the fruits of their labor. It was a far cry from the lonely dinners Caleb used to eat, staring out the window at a world that felt distant and cold. Now, with Kaya by his side, the meals were filled with conversation, sometimes light, sometimes serious, but always comforting. There were days when they worked together in the fields, their hands moving in rhythm as they planted crops, repaired fences, or tended to the animals. There were moments of laughter, of shared jokes that only they understood. Kaya's sense of humor, dry and quiet, always made Caleb smile, and he found himself looking forward to the time they spent together, even on the hardest days. But it wasn't just the work that made Caleb's heart lighter. It was the moments of quiet that came after the work was done. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire watching the flames flicker and dance, and talk about their pasts. Caleb had shared the story of losing Sarah, of the deep grief that had left him feeling hollow and lost. Rest. Kaya, too, had shared her story, the story of her people, her tribe, and the life she had been forced to leave behind. They spoke of the land they had both lost, the things they had both sacrificed. But there was no bitterness in their voices. It was simply the way of the world, the way of survival. And through it all they had found each other. Two people who had been through their own storms, but who had weathered them and come out stronger.
Caleb often thought about how different things could have been if he hadn't invited Kaya to stay.
The farm would have continued, of course, but it would have been a quiet, lonely place. There would have been no laughter, no shared moments, no one to care for the land with him. But Kaya had brought something back to his life that he thought he had lost forever. Hope. One evening, as the sun began to set, Caleb and Kaya walked to the edge of the field. The crops were almost ready for harvest, the rows of corn and wheat stretching out before them, a testament to the hard work they had both put in. Caleb felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. The farm had been a symbol of his struggle, but now it was something more. But it was a symbol of their strength, of what they had built together. "I never thought it would look like this," Caleb said. his voice soft as he gazed out at the land. Narration. After everything that's happened, I didn't know if I could keep going. But now... now it feels like we've got something worth holding on to. Kaya stood beside him, her gaze also fixed on the fields. We've worked hard, she said quietly. But it's not just the land. It's what we've built together. That's what matters. Burrs. Caleb turned to look at her, and for the first time he really saw her. She was standing tall, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun, her expression calm but filled with something he couldn't quite name. But she had been through so much. Loss, hardship, and a life on the run, but she had found a way to keep moving forward, to keep surviving. And now she had found a place where she could rest, a place where she could belong. You've given me something I didn't even know I needed, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. You've made this place feel like home again. I don't know how to thank you for that. Kaya looked at him, her eyes softening. Psst, you don't need to thank me, Caleb. I'm just here like you. We've both been through a lot, but we're still here, still standing. That's something worth celebrating. Caleb nodded, his heart full. For so long he had been alone, trapped in the memories of the past. But now, with Kaya by his side, he felt like he could face whatever the future held. But he knew what would come next. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. As the days passed, the town's whispers began to fade. Erase. Some people had accepted Kaya, while others still looked at her with suspicion. But Caleb didn't care anymore. He had made his choice, and it was the right one. Kaya was a part of his life now, and nothing would change that. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Caleb turned to Kaya, his heart suddenly full of something deeper than he had ever expected to feel again. Kaya, he said, his voice soft but steady. Would you stay here with me? Not just for now, but for always? Kaya looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. I've been running for so long, Caleb, she said quietly. I never thought I'd find a place where I could stop. But here, with you, I think I've found that place.
Caleb's heart swelled with relief, and he reached out to take her hand.
Then it's settled. We'll make this place our home.
Together. The fire crackled, and the world outside seemed to fade away. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt that everything was right. The land was thriving, the work was paying off, and most importantly, he had found someone to share it all with. Kaya had come into his life when he least expected it. And now, she was the missing piece that made everything whole. In the weeks that followed, they continued to work side by side, tending to the farm, building a life together. Caleb's once lonely farm had become a place of warmth, love, and purpose. They had both found something they had lost long ago, a sense of belonging, a sense of peace. And in the quiet moments when they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset and listening to the sounds of the land around them, Caleb knew that he had found something truly priceless. He had found a future, and with Kaya by his side, he knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it together.